Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. I know Udyr has only just come out, but I feel like I have a good enough grasp on the champion at this point to kind of give my first opinion and my first review of his rework, so sit back, relax, and let's talk about Udyr following his visual and gameplay update. Now, first, I really love a lot of the things that Riot have done for Udyr. I think they've done a lot to help make him feel like a newer champion. He definitely looks way better than he formerly used to, and I think that there are some things that they've done to help modernize his kit. However, there are still some decisions that I don't necessarily think were a good idea and that I feel like Udyr players might not be a fan of, and I think that as a result of some of these changes, Udyr's kit has some sticking points for me that I'm not a big fan of as well. So if you guys used to play Udyr though, let me know what you think of him down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about the Udyr versus Udyr and how you kind of consider that matchup. But either way, let's go ahead and talk about at least what I liked about new Udyr. Now, the biggest thing for me is that all of Udyr's stances feel impactful following his VGU. Old Udyr had the issue of Phoenix stance and Tiger stance overlapping as his DPS stances. Obviously, one was AoE and one was single target, but since you don't need two DPS abilities, one would kind of always be ignored in favor of the other, to the point where Riot allowed Udyr to only have to put points in 3 of his 4 abilities, because why would you need Phoenix stance if you're maxing Tiger, or Tiger stance if you're maxing Phoenix, right? There was sort of no reason to need one versus the other, especially not when you could build a Tiamat and have AoE after that point, right? You didn't really need the Phoenix stance at that point. The rework, however, means that each of Udyr's stances have their own distinct niches, which is really, really nice, and I think the biggest glow-up is, of course, to that Phoenix stance, now called Wingborn Storm. The biggest thing here is that it gives you a slowing AoE, which is massive for Udyr, because he has been a very kiteable champion historically, and having a built-in slow in his kit, especially an built-in AoE slow that also comes with damage, is a huge deal for Udyr. He gets on top of you, he bear slaps you, he activates Wingborn Storm, and then not only did he get on top of you, but also you're slowed, allowing him to continue to get more auto attacks off. It's a really, really nice glow up for Udyr as a whole. His other abilities all have their own sort of refined niches, I would say. W in particular, I think, has had a big glow up. The 2 healing auto attacks you get after activating the ability are massive, and the fact that you have a shield on top of that means that you're able to make most of that healing stick. Your opponent has to chew through the shield before they can get to your health bar, and by that point, you've actually healed a bunch of health back thanks to those 2 auto attacks. Obviously, if you awaken it, it's even more healing. It's a really, really powerful ability, and I sort of understand why it kept getting nerfed. Q is now optimal single target DPS, and the Awoken version is really nice for clearing individual targets. It definitely lets you shred down if you're starting a red buff or blue buff, for example. Start your Q and awaken it shortly after you've activated it, and you just kind of watch that buff's health bar melt. It's crazy how powerful that ability can be now. His E is his E. Nothing has really changed, but the Awoken version granting unstoppability is nice because it gives Udyr a little bit more flexibility on the approach. He can sort of say, in difficult to close champion matchups, I am going to sacrifice my Awoken slot in order to just guarantee that I can get through this Morgana Binding, I can get through this Janna Tornado, I can get through this CC ability, and keep whacking the target that I actually want to target. That's actually a kind of nice thing. He can also awaken it just as a sort of secondary gap closer. He presses Blazing Stampede to gain the movement speed, then he awakens it for another burst of movement speed, and the target may not actually see that coming. And because of this, and because each of Udyr's stances have their own niche now, they actually all float together very nicely, and this is doubly so because of Udyr's new passive. If you're using each of your 2 passive enhanced auto attacks when you enter a stance, then by the time you cycle through each of your stances, your first one is just coming off cooldown, allowing you to activate it then, and you just kind of keep going from there. So essentially, as long as you're in combat and using 2 auto attacks before swapping, you're almost guaranteed to just constantly have your 2 boosted auto attacks going, constantly getting the healing off of Iron Mantle, the bonus damage off of Tiger Stance. That's not Tiger Stance anymore, Wild and Claw, that's the name. Getting the slow aura up again. There's just a lot of things that I really, really like. The best thing, though, is that you don't actually have to wait. There is a brief lockout period where you can't activate another ability, but it does mean that if you walk up and bear stance, you don't actually have to wait for the second auto attack. You can immediately go into Wingborn Storm for the slow, so when your opponent does come out of the stun, they're actually slowed, so they can't run away, and then while the aura is active, you can then swap to Wild and Claw for the damage. It's just really, really nice how all of the abilities kind of tie together and work together, and that you sort of want at least one point in all of your abilities. There doesn't feel like a single button on Udyr's keyboard that he doesn't want to use nowadays. Everything flows together very, very nicely. I do like the Awoken abilities. I felt like that was a really good way for good Udyrs to show their skill versus Udyrs that are just now picking him up. I think that there's a big degree of skill that's shown by an Udyr choosing the correct ability to awaken at a given moment, potentially using the Awoken Blazing Stampede to get all the way in. Yes, it's very powerful, but maybe you want the enhanced Wingborne Storm to stick to somebody, maybe you want the enhanced DPS from an Awoken Wild and Claw, maybe you want to save it to potentially sponge off enemy burst damage from an Awoken Iron Mantle. There's a bunch of different things that you can do with it. It does feel like, however, that the cooldown is low enough that theoretically, again, if you're very good at your stance dancing and you can just kind of keep swapping constantly, that you can theoretically make this a 2 Awoken abilities per team fight mechanic, which is very, very potent indeed. And I think one of the best things that I like about Udyr as well is it feels like there's a variety of build paths available to him. If you get ahead, you can easily go a glass cannon build with things like Trinity Force. You can go for a tankier build if you really absolutely need to, because it feels like his damage is decent enough. You can go Bruiser, of course, that kind of melds the two. Even ability power, Udyr actually feels really strong. Wingborne Storm's AP ratio is nuts, and you can get one-shot by a full AP Udyr with just his Awoken R. It's kind of crazy, but it's kind of nice that Udyr has this flexibility in his build paths. I know it's something that he previously had. He definitely still has it nowadays. But now on to the bad. The biggest thing to me is that Udyr no longer has stances. Each of his abilities do something on cast, but they only grant benefits for his next 2 auto attacks or for 4 seconds. You don't actually enter a stance and have a permanent stance benefit like you used to. Blazing Stampede technically retains its old functionality, but the per target cooldown means that he doesn't want to stay in it for very long because he can only get the single stun and then he's sort of done. And so because of this, Udyr doesn't feel like he has the ability to press a stance and then stay in that stance for as long as he wants to, right? So you can't enter Wild and Claw because you want single target DPS and then stay there for your constant single target DPS. The way Udyr's kit works, you have to swap to something else because you won't get any more benefits unless you then choose to awaken Wild and Claw or unless you wait for the ability to come off cooldown on its own. And this just, I think, feels a little bad. It does mean Udyr is more of a button-pressing champion, and it leads to some feels-bad moments where you're like, I really want to retain this ability on cooldown and keep the benefits for it, but I have to swap to something else, and maybe that's not necessarily what I want. Part of the issue as well here, though, is that Udyr swapping is great, but he no longer has the movement speed that he got from his previous passive, and this means that Udyr has a lot of difficulty getting in. He always was a kiteable champion, I mentioned that earlier in the video, and the rework doesn't change that, but at least his old passive gave him a bunch of movement speed to potentially run down a target with. Udyr lost that movement speed, meaning it's even harder to gap close on the target because now you don't even have that extra bonus movement speed. You sort of press E and walk at them, and if you can't get close enough to them to actually force them to throw a crowd control skill shot, so then you can riposte that with your Awoken E, you kind of are SOL. You're never going to be able to close that gap because they're probably faster than you, or at least as fast as you, and eventually they'll run deep enough into their jungle to get help, or under a tower, and then you kind of have to give up on the play. And this is a very feels bad thing for me because I feel like it makes Udyr's life even harder to actually get in. He is better once he gets in because of the better stickiness he has from his slowing aura on his R. But again, that only matters if you can actually come to grips with your target, which means that things like Predator or Turbo Chem Tank feel like a must if he doesn't have a lot of melee targets that he can actually fight. Which just, I think in general, leads to Udyr feeling a little less flexible than he used to be. New Udyr also feels a little clunky. I didn't play a lot of old Udyr, so maybe there are some things in here that I'm missing, but New Udyr feels like there's a little bit of clunkiness with entering a stance. You press the button, and then it feels like there's a very brief animation that it feels like it's interrupting what you're trying to do. You have to press the button, and there's like a very brief window of Udyr has entered the stance, and so you can't auto-attack, you can keep moving, but it does mean that if you're entering Blazing Stampede for a point-blank stun, that there's like this very brief window where you can't actually auto-attack for the stun, you're just sitting there waiting for the animation to finish, and it's the same for the Awoken stances as well. Awakening a stance, there's like a very brief cast time window during which you can't auto-attack, and that just leads to Udyr feeling a little more clunky than I would have otherwise liked. Awoken is also really easy to accidentally do. Mashing W to get it to go off, for example, well, you press W, you activated it the second it came off cooldown, but then because you were mashing it, and because W is now on cooldown and your Awoken is off cooldown, you have now awoken your W, and you didn't want to do that, and now it's on cooldown, and now you feel like an idiot, right? It's the kind of thing where it really feels bad to be trying to activate your ability as fast as possible, and then it goes off, but then also then does an extra thing that you didn't want it to do, and it's just those little tiny things that I just don't like how Udyr feels. It also feels like Udyr's early clear has gotten significantly weaker. Admittedly, this might be me. I am still learning some of the optimizations on Udyr, which is something I like. I feel like the champion is very deep, surprisingly, for a champion that is all about just right-clicking things. I think he has a lot of depth to him, and so this may be on me, but it does feel like his early clear is significantly slower than it used to be. I really feel like old Udyr was able to clear exceptionally fast and beat basically everyone to Scuttlecrab, beat everyone to level 3, beat everyone to the first gank, and now it feels like he is very, very slow on his first clear through the jungle. You can keep your health up fairly well if you take Iron Mantle at level 2, but generally it just feels like you aren't able to clear as fast or as healthy as you used to, and that generally is a bit of a come down for a champion that used to be known for how powerful he was in the early stages of the game. Now, I don't think all these necessarily mean Udyr is a bad champion. He is brand new, and again, I feel like there's a lot of optimizations that are being figured out. He is definitely a very different champion from what he used to be, and I feel like if he had been designed today, I would have loved the design, but because we have the context from old Udyr, there are just some things about him that I am not quite a big fan of. But generally, I am a fan of the champion. I like the direction that Riot have taken, and I think at this point it's just going to come down to learning the champion and seeing what other people are actually going to do with him. I think that's going to be the biggest thing for me, seeing how Udyr does. In terms of his professional viability, I think that there are a lot of tools that Udyr brings to the table, but because of his early clear just not being that optimized, at least not as far as I've been able to discover, it does feel like it's going to take some time for him to catch on in pro play, and because of his kite ability, I really don't feel like he'll be a huge pro play staple. I know right now he really isn't either, so that much hasn't really changed. And I do think that there are some things that he does very well, that theoretically I think in the future he could be good professionally, but I think right now, for certain, he is not going to be a very good pro play staple. But I generally am a big fan of this rework. I know I talked a lot of crap about it, but I think the way he looks is really good, and I think a lot of the things about his kit are really nice. I just think it's going to take a little bit more time for the player base to figure him out, and maybe for Riot to iron out some of the clunkiness and some of the weird design choices that they've made. But you guys let them know what you think of Udyr down in the comment section below, especially what you've been building on him, how you've been playing him, especially in which lanes. I've tried him top lane. That didn't feel very good, but maybe you guys have found better success there. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.